This case involves murder, incest, polygamy, and the physical and sexual abuse of children. Marcus Wesson, the patriarch of the family, claimed that he was Jesus and that Jesus was a vampire. He also said that Jesus was a womanizer. The Wesson family studied the Bible 3 times a day, and Marcus would interpret the passages. He had a homemade Bible for his made-up religion, and in it he wrote, "Drinking blood was the key to immortality." And 5 years prior, he had even purchased 10 mahogany caskets, claiming that he was going to use them to repair a houseboat. When he bought the caskets, the women and children were tasked with loading them onto an old school bus that he had parked outside of their house. The family would watch a lot of vampire movies, and his youngest child even had a vampire-sounding name. Her first name is a combination of Jesus and vampire. Vadra was a 15th century prince in Romania, and he was, we think, Bram Stoker's inspiration for the name Count Dracula. Marcus's vampire name was, and I'll show it to you on the screen because I do not know how to pronounce this. He took the name Jesus, added his name, and then the word vampire, but to me it looks like a word scramble. In his made-up religion, he took bits from the Bible, the Mormon faith with the polygamy, the Rastafarian religion, and the Seventh-day Adventist, which is the religion that he grew up with. To understand how we got to this point, we have to take a look back at Marcus Wesson's childhood. Now, he was born in 1946, and he grew up in an abusive household. He said that his mother was obsessed with religion, and she conducted Bible study in her home, and she'd also hit her children with an electric cord. As a child, Marcus sang in the choir, he loved trains, and his favorite game was playing preacher. And at school, he'd wear dress pants, buttoned up shirts, and ties. His father never held a steady job, so he spent his days drinking and flirting with his own children. A childhood acquaintance of the family testified that when he was young, Marcus's father once paid him $50 to perform oral sex on him. And Marcus's father was an alcoholic, and he eventually left the family to be with his teenage male lover that was also a relative, but he came back 10 years later. Marcus dropped out of high school to join the military when he was 17, and in 1968 he left the army where he was a medical orderly, and then he moved to San Jose, California. Marcus started having an affair with Rosemary Matarina, who was 13 years older and was already married with 8 children, and she and her husband separated because of Marcus, and they eventually had a son together. They named him Adair. You'll hear the name Rosemary often, so I wanted to lessen the confusion. Rosemary Solario is Elizabeth Wesson's sister. Rosemary Matarina is Elizabeth's mother. This really had me confused at first. The information that I'm sharing with you in this section comes from Elizabeth herself, and all sources will be listed in the description. With 9 brothers and sisters, Elizabeth said that it was understandable that her mother didn't have much time to spend with each child separately. Marcus made things easier, she said. He always had time for her, and he taught her how to play card games and how to make little wooden cars. And she said that for an adult, he had a great imagination. They'd pretend that she was a princess and that he was her knight in shining armor. He always asked about her day, and he paid more attention to her than anyone else ever had. And with Marcus, she didn't have to take a backseat to her siblings, but she had no clue that she was being groomed. A year after he met Rosemary, he moved in, and Elizabeth loved the idea at first, but one night she woke up to a strange sound, and it was Marcus, so she laughed. She thought that he wanted to play a game because she was only 8 years old at this point. He told her that this is what people in love do, but you have to keep it a secret or people will get jealous and they'll try to split us up. He told her that they'd get married properly one day and that they'd have their very own house. And around this time, they had some sort of unofficial wedding. Elizabeth trusted Marcus completely, and she saw him as her best friend. She didn't think that he would ever do anything to hurt her. By the time that Elizabeth reached the age of 15, she was pregnant with his baby. Marcus told her mother that they were in love and that he wanted to officially marry Elizabeth. Elizabeth was very scared of how her mother would react, because Marcus was her mother's boyfriend after all. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, and she said that she was happy for her, but I wish I knew what she really felt. Elizabeth assumed that if her mother wasn't against it, then it must be a good thing. Her mother gave her written permission because Elizabeth was too young to get married without parental consent at the age of 15. Once married, Elizabeth saw Marcus's violent side. She said that he told her on the day that they met that he owned her, and he threatened to kill her if she ever left him. When their son Dorian was 18 months old and he was teething, he wouldn't stop crying. So Marcus screamed at Elizabeth to shut that baby up. She tried everything, but nothing helped. So Marcus picked up a bamboo cane and hit the back of Dorian's legs, making him bleed. She shouted no, but he told her that was how kids learned. She didn't understand it, but it had to be right because Marcus said so. His word was gospel. After that, Dorian quickly learned to suppress his cries, and the other children would learn this too. By the time Elizabeth was 26, she was a mother of 9, just like her own mother. They had one son named Stephen that died at birth, and they also had a son named Donovan that died when he was 6 months old. And Elizabeth said that she was done having children, but Marcus wanted to keep trying for more. She was scared to tell him that she was done having kids, but when she did, he agreed to let her get her tubes tied. But she wondered why he was suddenly so understanding. When Elizabeth's sister, also named Rosemary, was 29, she got into trouble with drugs, so Elizabeth agreed to take in her 4 nieces. Their ages ranged from 11 to 5. There would eventually be a total of 16 children in the house. To the girls, living with Marcus was a blessing at first because their uncles and other relatives had molested them. Their mother was never around because she abused drugs and alcohol, and she had multiple men in her life. Now, let's fast forward 10 years. Their oldest daughter, Kina, was 18 and pregnant. Elizabeth asked who the father was because she knew her daughter didn't have a boyfriend. She said that Kina just stared at the ground and she wouldn't answer her. Her expression looked familiar. It was the same expression that Elizabeth had when Marcus proposed to her in front of her mother. Now Elizabeth knew the truth. He had been abusing their daughter. That was why he was so understanding when Elizabeth said she didn't want any more children. He didn't need her to give him more children. He had daughters for that now. Kina gave birth to a daughter named Illabelle. Marcus told Elizabeth that the Lord wanted him to carry on having lots of children and to impregnate his daughters. He told her that he was Jesus reborn. Eventually, Ruby and Sebhrenah were given permission to move out, but there was a catch. Their children had to stay behind. The boys that were old enough had already moved out by this point. In this religion, incest played a big part. Marcus believed that through incest, one produced a perfect seed of oneself. Marcus practiced something that he called loving, and loving is just a prettier sounding word. It was molestation. Some of the girls even testified that they learned how to perform oral sex around the age of 8 or 9, and they had to wash his dreads and scratch his armpits. If any of the girls talked to a man outside of the family and Marcus found out, they would be beaten. The girls had to wear long sleeve shirts, and their skirts had to go down to their ankles to cover the bruises. And when the girls were out with Marcus, they had to walk behind him with their heads down. The boys in the family weren't allowed to talk to their sisters, and the girls were not allowed to talk to their mother. Because of this, the brothers knew very little about what was going on between their father, their sisters, and their cousins. The children were so well hidden that many neighbors didn't even know they existed until the day they died. Marcus had incestuous relationships with his daughter, Kina and Sebhrenah, as well as his nieces, Rosa and Safina Solorio and Ruby Ortiz. Ruby testified that Marcus began molesting her when she was just 8 years old. He told her that it was a father's way to show affection to his daughter. By the time Ruby was 13, Marcus told her that she was old enough to marry him, and that God wants men to have more than one wife. He also emphasized that God's people are becoming extinct. We need to preserve God's children. We need to have more children for the Lord. This led to Ortiz having one child with Wesson, a baby boy named Aviv. At one point, 4 or 5 of the girls were pregnant. He encouraged his child brides to compete for his affection, and they often grew jealous of the private time that he spent with their siblings. He told them that he wanted to have one child with each of them, but he couldn't stop himself, and he kept getting them pregnant. The girls saw themselves as surrogates for Elizabeth because she had her tubes tied, as I mentioned earlier. Marcus was fascinated with David Koresh, the cult leader in Waco, Texas, and he had multiple wives. The family was glued to the television during the federal siege of the compound in 93, where Koresh and 80 of his followers died. And Marcus said, "This is how the world is attacking God's people." He said that Koresh was making children for the Lord, so he went on to tell his daughters and nieces that they should be doing the same thing, making children for the Lord. The family had very little money, and Marcus was not interested in working. The kids had to dig through trash cans for food, while Marcus had money to buy fast food for himself. And the kids would look for bottles and cans on the beach to turn in for recycling money, and they'd bathe in public bathrooms. His daughter Kina wrote in her diary that they had nothing to eat but rice. A year before the murder, she wrote, "I hope we make it today. I can't go any longer." And although some were able to get jobs, Marcus controlled their paychecks. He controlled their paychecks to the point where they were forced to pool their nickels and dimes to buy food. Marcus's son, Serafino, talked about being beaten for 20 minutes for eating an extra spoonful of peanut butter. Adrian Wesson said there were times as a child when he couldn't speak, he would use the bathroom in his pants, and he couldn't walk for a week because the beatings were so bad. Earlier in the day, 2 of Elizabeth's nieces came to demand that Marcus give them their children back. He'd recently said that he was moving everyone to Washington State. So when Elizabeth came home, she sees Sophina and Ruby. Sophina screaming, "Give us our children back," and Ruby screaming, "He wants to take our babies." They also learned that Marcus was still having sex with their daughters and nieces, and he broke a promise that he made to them that he would stop. When Sophina entered the house, she grabbed her son by the hand, and then all hell broke loose. The child was pulled away from her. In the doorway, Marcus blocked anybody else from coming in. Sophina said that Kiani, Sebhrenah, Rosa, and 17-year-old Elizabeth called her Judas. Sebhrenah also called Ruby an adulterer for leaving the house. So when Marcus's wife Elizabeth sees all of this happening, she freezes from fear because she knows that this will not end well. She knows that there will be hell to pay. But when she sees Marcus, he looks calm and he walks back into the house. So she follows him. She goes inside too. But she immediately notices how quiet it was in the house. There were no babies crying. There were no sounds of children playing or laughing. And she sees a coffee table pushed up against a door. She slowly pushes it aside and she opens the door. The room was dimly lit, but she could see Marcus kneeling with his arm wrapped around their 17-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. His shirt was all covered in blood, and wooden coffins were lined up all against the wall. And she saw the pale and lifeless faces of her children, her nieces, her grandchildren, her great-nieces, and nephews. Each child had been shot in the eye, and they were stacked from youngest to oldest. And on top was 25-year-old Sebhrenah, and she had a .22 caliber pistol underneath her arm. The youngest was little Jeva. She was just a year old. Elizabeth ran from the room screaming, and she collapsed in the arm of a police officer. He told his children that the police were the devil in disguise, and that suicide was an acceptable way to escape them. And if authorities ever tried to remove the children, he told his daughters and nieces to first kill their children and then themselves. He would, of course, remain behind to explain their decision to the public. Sophina said that they held monthly meetings to discuss the details of the suicide plot, including how to shoot to kill. At least 4 family members and witnesses said that they heard what sounded like gunshots after the cops arrived. Other witnesses and relatives and some police said that they heard no loud bangs or gunshots. And the police chief said that his officers didn't hear any gunshots. A criminology professor says research shows that eye or ear witnesses can be unreliable. So for example, let's say you have 3 witnesses. Each witness will give you a different account. Our memories become fuzzy, and one witness can be influenced by another one. So Chief Diary said that it's unlikely that his officers wouldn't ignore gunshots. I can't say for sure if the police did or did not hear any gunshots. Marcus had initially ignored the instructions to come out of the house, and he ran into a back bedroom as 2 women went running out of the house. One officer was standing on the neighbor's roof, while another one was behind the school bus that he had parked outside of their house. And there was an officer behind every tree out there with his gun drawn, one of the neighbors said. One of Marcus's sons told the police that he owned a .22 caliber gun, so they called for the SWAT team. The police demanded that he unlock the door and speak to an officer. And by that time, the SWAT team arrived to evacuate the neighborhood. It was all over by then. When officers grabbed Marcus, he instructed them to use 3 handcuffs because his wrists were so thick. Marcus was no longer in control. Sebhrenah was crying, he did it, they're all gone. The bodies were still warm, so Officer Escareno yelled for an ambulance, and then he started grabbing wrists, searching for a pulse. Unfortunately, he didn't find any, and he was so upset that other officers had to pull him from the room. And because the bodies were in such a tangle, it would take hours before the police could even determine how many victims there were, and it would be several days before they were all identified. In trying to determine the next of kin, the coroner had DNA testing done on all of the victims. The true extent of what had been happening in that house was finally revealed. Gypsy said that Sebhrenah and Ruby knew of the murder-suicide pact, and they had once agreed to be a part of it. And she said that they knew that Marcus would never give up the children, and they were the reasons that the children were dead. Witnesses testified that Elizabeth knew about the incest, as well as the family's murder-suicide pact. And Sebhrenah also testified that Marcus stabbed her in the chest when she talked about leaving the family. And she later displayed the scar on her chest for the jury to see. Rosa Solorio had 2 children that were killed, and she still wore the wedding ring that Marcus gave her. And she said that she still loved him and considered herself his wife. On the witness stand, when asked why her husband didn't work, Elizabeth said with a straight face, "You can't work when you're on welfare." Marcus Wesson Jr. said that he was surprised when his sisters and cousins, who were not even allowed to date, started showing. And they told him that they got pregnant by artificial insemination, but he thought that that was weird. And Adrian Wesson was also suspicious. The babies looked just like their father, he told the jurors. Marcus Wesson was found guilty on all counts, and on June 27, 2005, he was sentenced to 102 years for the rape and the molestation charges. Even though he didn't pull the trigger, if it wasn't for his suicide pact and his teachings, none of this would ever have happened, just like the Manson murders. For the murder of his children and grandchildren, he received the death penalty, and he was sent to San Quentin. So he's now in the company of infamous murderers like Rodney Alcala, Charles Ng, and Scott Peterson. This case didn't get as much attention because at the same time the Scott Peterson case was going on. Also, when this case got to trial, the Michael Jackson case was going on. So there were 2 different things that took attention away from this case. That's why it's not that well known. Only 13 people have been executed in the 33 years since California's death penalty was reinstated, and there haven't been any since 2006. And in March of 2019, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, signed a moratorium on the death penalty, sparing Marcus Wesson's life. Elizabeth and her children have come to see how brainwashed they had been and how messed up Marcus was. And she said that it took her 5 years of counseling for her to realize that. In 2009, there was a book that was written about their family by a reporter that covered the case. Elizabeth, Gypsy, and Kina had never been to school and they didn't have any money, so she invited them to share her apartment. And Kina lived with her for several years. Gypsy has a daughter and named her Alicia in honor of the woman that took her in, also the author of the book. Kina has another daughter. Serafino is married with 3 children. In 2010, the family spoke to reporters at ABC News, and they no longer have any contact with Marcus. Elizabeth said that because she didn't protect her children, she will never have peace. Serafino remembers police shouting for his dad to come out. He said when he did come out, he looked directly into his eyes. He was calm, but he had this look of helplessness. And Adrian is now a personal trainer and an employee at Levi Strauss & Company. And he didn't know that being beaten for 2 hours because he asked his mom to roll down a car window was anything but normal. When he thinks of his father, he sees only a shadowy figure. For the first time in our lives, he said, "We are free."